we're going to discuss my journey and how it led me to starting this business, as well as the lessons that I learned from it, which is really something that I want to share with all of you, which is the important part of um, tonight's live is what did I learn from it and how can I help others who are either going through that or may not be in a similar situation in the coming years or months. So I'll start with, the day that my mom had a stroke. It was in June of 2016, and it was just a regular Sunday evening. I had actually gone out to dinner with her the Friday before. This was on a Sunday, and she was complaining of a sinus infection and having a headache, and she couldn't get rid of it. And nothing she was taking was helping her. And she's from that old school where you didn't run to the doctor for everything. You tried everything under the sun at home to kind of help and heal yourself. And she was a fairly healthy woman, didn't have any major medical issues. So it was surprising when 2 days later, and that night at dinner, mind you, I had asked her to please make sure she goes to see a doctor if she wasn't getting any better. So 2 days later, she promised me she would go that Monday. Sunday comes, and I get a phone call from my sister that my dad thinks that my mother had a stroke. They were at a casino in Philadelphia, and they live in New York. So they were pretty far from home. So I immediately called the hospital and spoke with one of the ER doctors. And this was something that my mother was 69 years old, didn't have any major medical issues. This was completely something we were unprepared for and didn't even really think about. But that's usually when traumatic, traumas happen and you're kind of faced with them in a very real moment. So back to call up the ER doctors, and the doctor pretty much tells me, and my sisters don't even know this. I have 3 sisters. And the ER doctor tells me that my mother did have a stroke. She didn't know what kind of stroke. It was something she had never seen before. And the odds of her surviving it through the night were very small, and that I should get down there along with my siblings as soon as possible to say our goodbyes because they didn't think she was going to make it through the night. To this day, I've never shared that with my sisters, and they have asked me numerous times on that night while we were all driving to Philly in 4 separate cars, mind you, had asked me, did they say anything? Did they say what our chances are? Did they say anything like that? And I was like, no, because my sisters would have just been more of a basket case, and nobody needed to hear that while they're on their way. We get there to be told that she was helicoptered from one hospital to another because they didn't have the capability to deal with her where she was. So she was going to this hospital that we never even heard of in Philadelphia called Hahnemann University. And there we were. So we waited for her to arrive, and the doctors came out and pretty much told us that they weren't sure. Again, still not sure about her, the type of stroke that she had, and didn't really know what was going on. One doctor would say that she had a bleed in the brain, and other doctors were saying that they think it would be blood clots. They weren't really sure, and I didn't understand why they weren't sure. That just didn't, your medical facility. She's gone from hospital to hospital. How can you not really understand? But when the next day, through that first night, this was in the middle of the night, so the next morning when the head of neurosurgery came in and started asking for medical history, he was just like, he was puzzled as well. So I decided to think, well, maybe some other medical history might help. So I offered up some of my own medical history, which was that I had a blood clot, 10 years prior, and they had tested me for some genetic markers, which I came back positive. When I shared that with them, the head of the neurosurgeon department immediately had an aha moment and said, I know exactly what kind of stroke your mother had. He ordered some tests, came back later, confirmed that she had something called a CVST, which was basically she had 5 blood clots in the front sinus area of her brain. Out of 10 million stroke victims, only 5 have this type of stroke. That's how rare it was. 5 people out of 10 million that suffer from a stroke have this kind of stroke. And the statistics for survival are less than 10%. But we weren't going to accept that. We weren't ready to let her go. They put her in a medically induced coma, and we just did our best to be there. We talked to her. They told us that she could hear us. She was medically induced, and it was probably like the toughest time of our lives. So one of the things that we needed to do was to believe that she was going to wake up and she was going to come through this and she was going to be okay. We would look up and try and talk to people that may have been through something similar and what were their experiences. And those stories of, my grandma had a stroke or my wife had a stroke and they pulled through and they were walking and talking and eating again. Those were the things that we had to hold on to because the alternative just wasn't acceptable. So she went into a medically induced coma, followed by a vegetative state, which basically the difference is medically induced, they're giving her medicine to make her sleep so that her brain has time to heal and her body has time to heal. And then once they were, the swelling, once actually they came to us, then and said that, that she couldn't be on a ventilator for more than 2 weeks, otherwise risk of infection sets in. So they had to put in a trach and a feeding tube so she can get nutrition. Both can be completely undone at a certain point when a patient is ready to move on in a way. Then basically they came to us 2 weeks afterwards and said that this was a last resort. They needed to remove her skull, half of her skull. She had a big hole in her head because the swelling was so much that because of the 5 clots, the blood was backing up, therefore leaving too much pressure in the brain. And I'm getting into detail with you so that you understand what was going on as the next events unfold. So they took off part of her skull, and at that point, they took her out of the medically induced coma and wanted her to wake up on her own. She then didn't. So she was in a vegetative state where she would come out of it, for moments here and there, like a fluttering of an eye. You could get her to squeeze a hand. She was not very awake all the time. And she was on a ventilator with her trach. And because she wasn't awake, she couldn't protect her airway, which is something that they do. And you're probably learning a lot about ventilators now on the news with everything going on. So she then was transferred to a facility that specialized in weaning patients off of a ventilator. While we were there, we had asked the neurologist if I spoke to a pharmacist and a couple of pharmacists, and they told me that the medications that they had my mother on were probably the main reason why she was in this vegetative state, because they were so, her doses were so high and she was on so many that they were just making her into this comatose state. They had suggested that I reach out to a neurologist that was covering and see if they can start to wean her off some of the meds that she might be more awake. So we reached out to the local neurologist that was caring for her. He just decided to stop her medication, just stops her pills. I just don't understand. I still don't understand that. He claims that he was doing what the family wanted, but that's not what the family wanted. We wanted him to wean her, which anybody who is on any kind of seizure medication knows that you don't just stop that stuff. You have to wean it off in a hospital facility while someone's hooked up to monitor. Turned out to be a blessing in disguise, because when, she then went into a seizure because he stopped her meds. And when we brought her, during that time while she was at that facility, taking her off the ventilator, we would monitor her breathing. And we knew how to read the machines at this point. We had become little mini experts. And they would take her off the machine a certain amount of minutes and hours each day to wean her off. We had eventually told them that we didn't want her to be put back on as long as she was not under any stress, that we could, leave her off. And if her numbers started to get bad, then we would put her back on. And they didn't want to do that, but we pushed. We told them, if there's not any medical reason why she needs to go back on, and her numbers are all good, her heart rate's good, her pulse ox is good, everything is good, why do we need to push it? If she starts to get tired, then we put her back on. So we pushed back a number of times on things with some of these doctors. And so she had pretty much weaned herself off of the machine because she never had to go back on until she went into this seizure from the doctor not giving her meds. So we wound up going to another hospital who helped us get her into Kessler Rehab, which is one of the top rehab facilities for this type of care in the area. And so that was the blessing in disguise. And we found her some doctors who understood it a little bit more. And we took the next step. So basically, she then went into rehab, and she was doing well because the doctor stopped the medication. When we were in the hospital, they kind of regulated a little bit more, and she was more awake. She was starting to able to be awake. And when someone has a stroke, their body pretty much resets. So she had to learn how to talk, how to walk, how to eat, basically everything, how to read, how to write. Those are things that she needed to redo. And she was also partially paralyzed on one side. So while she was at a rehab facility, she then went into septic shock because we didn't know that she had a infection in her kidney. And they were testing her cultures and everything on a regular basis, and even would do an occasional scoping with a camera, but the infection was above the bladder, which again, something new we didn't know. And there was a big stone there that was blocking it. She went into septic shock and started having seizures, very high fever, bring her to the hospital, and they pretty much said, I remember this morning clearly. I was getting ready for work. My sister told me that they were taking her to the ER, and I said, okay, let me know when you get there. And I thought it was just a seizure and that they would get it under control. And then the ER doctor gets on the phone with me to tell me that they had to give her a lot of Ativan, and they're just letting me know because the side effect is cardiac arrest. So I'm like, okay, I'm not going to go to work today. I'm going to go check this out and figure out what's going on, because I just didn't like the way that what the doctor was saying and how this was going, this conversation. It just didn't sit well with me. Glad I did get to the ER. I literally went over to the room. My family was sitting in the waiting room, and then I immediately hear code red or code blue. I don't remember which code it was. And they said her room that I was literally standing outside of, and she had coded. First time she lost oxygen for a minute. Then they revived her. She coded a second time. This time she lost oxygen for 8 minutes. She was out. They were doing CPR. At this point, the ER doctor came to me and said, we'd like you to sign a DNR. Now, I'm my mother's healthcare proxy. And I said, is my mother brain dead? They said, no. I said, well, then I'm not signing a DNR. I'm pushing back. I'm not agreeing to what you're saying. I want to know what are her odds. And they pretty much said that after 4 minutes, her organs start to shut down and lose oxygen, and that they would highly recommend a DNR because she might be a vegetable. I said, well, we've already gone down that road. So if that's what's going to happen, she's come too far for us to let her go now. And if you're not confirming that she's brain dead, then I'm not signing a DNR. The doctor then was fighting with me, then at this point, my family is now fighting with me, telling me, if this is what the doctor's recommending, I should just, let it go. And I'm like, no, I refuse to let it go. I knew in my gut, this wasn't going to be the end. So the doctor tells me that the only thing keeping her alive is epinephrine when they give her, that's the only thing that keeps her heart going. I said, well, we already know that you gave her too much Ativan, which I understand because you had to stop the seizures. But if the epinephrine's keeping her alive, why don't you just put her on a drip till the Ativan wears off, right? Isn't that the end of isn't like, that seemed logical to me. Somebody with zero medical training, just basically somebody who had been through different hospitals and facilities and had been researching stuff every time something happened. This is what I suggest to the ER doctor, who then says, okay, they will do that. My mother codes then a third time. And at this point, they put her on an epinephrine drip until the Ativan could wear off. The next morning, when they stopped the epinephrine and the Ativan has worn off at this point, she didn't code. She didn't code again after the drip went on. And the next morning, when she woke up, the same as she was before she went to that hospital. There was no additional brain damage. They had no explanation as to why there was no additional brain damage. They had no explanation as to, how she just woke up and everything was fine. And my explanation was, we weren't giving up on her. We were fighting for her. And because we knew that she was a fighter and we weren't going to let her go that way. So pushing back and, really, because I think to myself, had we signed that DNR after that second time that she coded, we never would have gotten those additional few years from her. So I'm extremely grateful for that pushback, and my family is as well. It's such a highly emotional time for families, and these doctors, they see patients, not all, but a good number of them see patients as to what they are on paper. And it's unfortunate because there's so much more than that. Once we got through this hurdle, and my mom had been back in therapy, and then there was some insurance issues with her therapy. There were people that I spoke to and who told me that were in the industry and had gotten my mom into some trials with therapy. So even though she wasn't covered going through insurance for therapy, she had been accepted into some trials and was still getting extra therapy, but not on our dime, and she was part of studies. So she was actually testing new equipment, and it was pretty cool. She was excited to be part of it. We were excited that we were testing advanced equipment, and that came from recommendations from people. The next step on this journey was I was the primary bather for my mom because nobody at this, remember, she had her skull removed. So at this point, people did not, my sister, no, everyone was afraid to really touch her head. So I was the only one that really watched a lot of videos and learned as much as I can on how to wash someone's hair that is missing part of a skull. So I noticed that I was starting to see some nails and some screws, and her skin was getting very thin. We brought her to the local neurologist that was canceling her for her medicines, and he said everything seemed fine. I just wasn't sitting well with me. And he then made another appointment. They canceled that appointment and then gave us an appointment 3 months later. I said, I'm not waiting another 3 months. I called her surgeon, or the person who did the surgery, and he took her right away. And when I brought her in, he said, you're very lucky because this is the worst case of absorption I've ever seen in my career. Basically what that means is actually this was after she had I skipped a step. So my mother had her skull put back on. It was her skull that they had frozen and they put back on her head at some point. This was after that. I started to see the nails and the screws, and it just didn't look right. So when I brought her to the doctor, he said it was the worst case of resorption he had seen, that the body was rejecting her own skull, and it was actually wearing away at it. And he said that then we immediately had to do surgery on her. And he said that it was so thin, it was like an eggshell, and it was shattered, that it took them, I think it was supposed to be a 45-minute surgery. It took them closer to 3 hours, I think it was, they had to pull out each little piece by piece, just because it was so thin and so fragile. And they had to, so that goes along the lines of, if something doesn't feel right, go with it. So the tragic end to this whole story is that my mom, as stubborn as she was doing so well in her therapy, and she was just very excited to learn to stand on her own. And part of the issue was, we had spoken to a neurologist that with that stroke that she had, she didn't really understand consequences. So when she would stand up or do something that she wasn't supposed to do, she didn't understand that she could fall or get hurt, or she shouldn't be doing this or that. So about 2 years and it was 2 years and 8 months after the first day that she had the stroke, she decided she was going to put herself in her wheelchair, and had my dad help her to the bathroom. But my dad was making her lunch, and he was on his way upstairs when she called for him to come. But at that point, she was already putting herself in the wheelchair and fell and banged her head. And because she was on blood thinners, and her blood was thin, and she had an aneurysm that burst. And they pretty much, when they got to the ER, I mean, she was, from the time that she fell to the time that she got to the ER, it was, I think, 2 hours and 8 minutes or something like that. And basically, she was fine. She didn't, she was fighting with me about going to the ER because it was snowing that day. So I had my sister pick her up with an SUV. I'm like, now you don't have a reason to. And she was in the car and literally got a little bit nauseous and then passed out blocks away from the ER. And at that point, the nurse told me later on that her pupils were already dilated when they pulled her out of the truck. So, they put her on life support, and they did what they had to do, and they did their best to stop the bleed, but they pretty much told us that it was like trying to block a faucet with a cotton ball, that the burst was so bad. It wasn't just a leak. It was literally burst open, the artery in her brain. And basically, she was then on life support, and at that point, she was confirmed brain dead, so we let her go. So now the reason why I've shared this with you, besides, hey, why not cry together? The reason why I'm sharing this all with you is a few things. One, in the beginning of the story, we had not been prepared for anything. We did not know how to do any of. We didn't know what to do, what to expect. We had challenges with dealing with bank accounts. We learned that we had more rights had she been deceased than in a coma. You can't access anything when somebody's still alive, but just in a coma. So we realized that there were issues there. We had never really discussed what her wishes were if she had gotten to this stage in life and something did happen. What were her wishes? So we weren't prepared for any of this. And not that it's ever something that you can really prepare for, but there are some things that you can do to prepare for any type of emergency that would be good for, and people of any age to take care of. Another thing that I wanted to bring is, we in the beginning, we had faith. They told us that so many times that they didn't think that she was going to make it. When the first 2 weeks, they didn't think she was going to make it. She had less than 10% chance of survival. Day in the ER when she had coded, they pretty much said that she wasn't going to come through. There was a couple other times where, she shouldn't, with the skull being replaced, that it was more than 90% resorbed. I mean, she could have died at any moment with that. It could literally, something could have hit her or anything, and we could have had some major issues. But we had faith, and we didn't allow people's negativity. There were plenty of people that were sending condolences when she first was in the coma, and it's like, people try to do what they think is best for others, but I don't think people always think things through. And there were a lot of negative comments that they didn't think were negative, but they were received in a negative way. And doctors and nurses would make comments about, letting her go and things like that. And we just didn't believe it. We had faith, and we believed in her, and we believed in our research and things that we knew, and we didn't let go. Pushing back. So pushing back was a pivotal part of keeping her going for the 2 years and 8 months that we did. We pushed her back when she was in the ER when they coded, and I wouldn't sign the DNR. We pushed back. I pushed back on so many things that her doctors, were sick of me. And I literally would say to them each and every time, are you prepared to deal with the liability if I'm right? I used to say, I want this test done, or I want that test done. Because sometimes they see a patient and they don't think the patient's going to make it, so they're not going to give their full effort and go all out. But that wasn't acceptable to me. So pushing back was a huge, huge part of her being around. And, it's just, I can't explain how important it is. Now, I'm not a medical student. I'm not a nurse. I'm not in any sort of medical professional, but I would do my research and I would question things. Like, questioning was a huge, huge part of my role. I questioned everything. I would tell the doctor, because doctors speak in their doctor language, and nurses speak in, the same medical language, and nurses would often explain things a little bit more, but at the end of the day, I questioned everything. I wanted to know if we went down this road or that road, which way, what are the consequences here? What are the consequences there? I asked the difficult questions that people don't want to ask because it's scary. You don't want to hear the answer. You could die, or, your loved one could die. You don't want to hear the answer, but to me, I needed to know the answers. I needed to know what I was facing. I needed to know what our options were. I needed to know. And, one of the other things is talking. You're not alone. And no matter what situation you're in caregiving, you're not alone in this isolation, this social distancing. You're not alone in who you're, how you're caregiving for people, the situations, and there are so many people that have gone through it, and I learned that. There were so many people. I went into different Facebook groups. I spoke to different people that I didn't even realize had connections in the physical therapy world, and what they actually did, and connections to get her in this hospital or that hospital. I spoke to everyone, and I spoke to everybody about what was going on and what I needed help with. That was the most important thing. And when you put it out there what you need help with, and it took me a long time to learn that I can ask for help and what to ask for. But I needed to know myself what I needed help with, and I talked to others about what I needed. I talked to my coworkers. There were plenty of people at work that helped me out with things. My company itself helped me tremendously throughout the beginning, and my boss was extremely understanding. And if there were days that I needed to be at this hospital or that hospital, they worked with me. And I am forever grateful for all of that, because I could not have gotten through it if people weren't there by my side. So talking and including others is a huge part of caregiving. It's a huge part of life. And it brings me to my last point, which is trust your gut. Always trust your gut. Your intuition, you just know when something doesn't feel right, when something doesn't, seem right. Your body better than anybody. And we knew my mother so well. We knew when there were things going on. We knew when something wasn't right. And there would be times when they would tell us, no, this is normal or this is not. Like that neurologist told us, that her skull seemed normal, but it just didn't. I just knew that it wasn't right. One, from talking to people, I asked other people if they had ever experienced it with their loved ones, and most of the people said no. And then I went with my instinct and reached out directly to the surgeon, go to the source and get your answers. So trust your gut. It won't fail you. It won't fail you because things that you may not want to admit to yourself, oftentimes your gut is a way of telling you, what's right and what's not in any aspect of life, whether it's caregiving, medical, and anything. So that is, my journey, and that's certainly where it brings me to today, which is pretty much how I started this business. We had a ton of questions with no answers, and we didn't have solutions, and we didn't know what to do next. That's pretty much was a big thing. Like, what do we do next? And or what can we do? Or there's got to be a better way. I mean, there were times that a doctor pretty much said that when we were teaching her to stand, to just hold her by her pants, and I'm like, there has to be a safer way. You're not going to tell me this $10 pair of pants is keeping her safely snug. This could rip at any moment, and if I'm grabbing her by her pants, but at the end of the day, they just didn't know. Those things existed, but they didn't know. They didn't know how to get them to patients and to families. And that's where Wellness Resource Support came from. I want to be that resource. I want to help families that were just like me. And that's the whole reason I started this business. And I started this business when my mother was still alive, and she was very happy and excited. And she would be in hospitals and facilities and telling people, oh, you want this, you got to talk to my daughter. She'll tell you where to get it. And because they would ask her, where'd you get this or that, like things for her wheelchair or things that would help us get her around, and she would be like, ask my daughter. And she was happy. And she was happy that we were able to help other people. And so now this business has become her legacy, this is in her honor and her memory, and families that don't need to go through this alone. But sorry, it's tough. It's really tough, but because we all miss her terribly, and she was such a good person and had such a good heart and always put other people first. And that's what we're here to do, is to put other people first and to kind of help wherever we can. So I wasn't expecting to be this emotional tonight. So I, with this, would like to offer some resources that I'm going to be having coming up. I'm going to be doing some webinars on basically discussing the topics that I brought up tonight: how to prepare, how to push back, knowing when to trust your gut, having faith, staying positive, all of these ways that we can go into more depth, and I'm offering them for people to help out as much as I can. And if you'd like to be on those webinars and to learn when they are, there's the link in the description to sign up for the mailing list. And then the first one is going to be on May 19th. It's a Tuesday, I believe. And we're going to get started because I want to help people, and I want to help them be as prepared as they can be, even if it's not something anybody wants to deal with. But sometimes just knowing, if something ever does happen, you have some information, or where to get information, and that's where we get in. So there is a link in the description. There should be a link in the description, and from there we'll be sending out an email with the details for the webinar. So thank you all for bearing with me tonight and dealing with my emotional outburst. And I will see you all next week. Have a good night. Thanks.